The day my fiancé told me I wasn't wife material, he didn't just end our relationship, he basically set his own life on fire and didn't realize it yet. And it started so casually I almost didn't catch it because we were sitting in our kitchen like normal. Like we hadn't spent 4 years building a life together. Like we weren't literally engaged with wedding plans half done on my phone. And he just looked at me with this tired expression I'd started seeing more and more often over the last few months and said I wasn't what he wanted anymore. That I wasn't wife material. That he'd find someone better. And I remember blinking at him like I didn't process the words correctly because it sounded too ridiculous to be real. Like something someone says in a bad movie before the audience laughs. But he didn't laugh. He just stood up, grabbed his keys, and left like I was furniture he was done using. And I just sat there for a second waiting for my brain to catch up, waiting for the emotional crash that never came in the way people expect, because instead of crying, I actually laughed, like a short, breathy laugh, because I genuinely couldn't believe a man who had seen me at my worst, who had lived with me, who had made promises to me, thought he could reduce me to not enough, and walk away like it was nothing. And that laugh was the moment something in me shifted, not broken, just switched off toward him. And I started remembering all the little things I ignored, like how he started criticizing how I dressed, how he'd make comments like, "You'd look better if you were more put together like other girls," or how he'd suddenly become obsessed with what other women looked like on social media, comparing me in ways that were always framed as just being honest. But honesty shouldn't make you feel like you're constantly being evaluated. And then came the emotional manipulation phase where every concern I raised was suddenly me being too sensitive or paranoid, like I was the problem for noticing the shift in his behavior, like I was supposed to smile through being slowly replaced in real time. And I remember one night I asked him who he was texting so late and he didn't even look up, just told me to relax, that I was overthinking everything. And I actually started doubting myself, which is the part I hate admitting because I know now how intentional that kind of confusion is, how it makes you easier to control. And the engagement itself started feeling like a trap instead of a milestone because every time I tried to talk about wedding plans, he'd sigh like I was stressing him out. Like I was the problem for wanting to build the life we agreed on, and I should have known something was wrong when someone starts treating your shared future like a burden. But I stayed because I thought history meant something. I thought 4 years meant loyalty. But apparently for him, it just meant familiarity while he was already mentally checking out. And then after he left that night saying I wasn't worthy of being his wife, I didn't chase him, I didn't beg. I just started packing his things slowly, like I was cleaning up after a guest who overstayed their welcome. And the silence from him came quickly at first, just defensive messages saying I was overreacting, that he didn't mean it like that I should understand his frustration. Which is always funny because apparently men can say the most damaging things and still expect emotional comfort afterward. And then his family started texting me like I was the one who did something wrong, telling me to talk to him, to be patient, to be understanding, like I was supposed to fix the damage he caused to my own dignity. And I didn't respond because I realized something important in that moment, which is that people who benefit from your silence will always call you unreasonable when you stop providing it. And then the internet did what it always does because within weeks I saw him online with someone new, smiling like he had upgraded his life, like I was just a draft version he discarded. And people actually reinforced that narrative in comments like she was an upgrade, like I was a placeholder instead of a person. And I won't lie, that part stung for a second. Not because I wanted him back, but because it confirmed how little respect he actually had for what we had. Because you don't talk about replacing someone you supposedly loved like you're swapping a phone model. And I moved on faster than he expected. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because I was done participating in my own disrespect. And I started rebuilding quietly. New routines, new boundaries, new peace. And I met someone else later who didn't make love feel like a competition or a test, who didn't compare me to strangers online, or make me feel like I was constantly auditioning for approval, and I didn't broadcast it. I just lived it, which is why it was so ironic when my ex suddenly started resurfacing months later, liking old pictures, sending messages from different accounts, deleting them and resending them like I was supposed to chase him through breadcrumbs of regret. And then the messages turned into apologies, into I miss us. Like he had rewritten history in his head where he didn't say what he said, where he didn't leave the way he left, where I was supposed to forget the exact moment he told me I wasn't worthy of being his wife, and I didn't respond. Not out of spite, but because there was nothing left to say. And then the situation with his upgrade fell apart in a way that honestly didn't even involve me directly, because apparently, the woman he left me for was still legally married, and that entire situation blew up publicly when her actual husband exposed everything, messages, receipts, timelines, all of it, and suddenly the man who thought he had leveled up was just another name attached to a messy scandal. And I didn't celebrate it because I didn't need to. Karma doesn't require audience participation. It just happens. And that's when his messages got desperate. Not confident anymore, not arrogant, just frantic. Saying things like he made a mistake, that he finally realized what he lost, that nobody understood him like I did. Which is always the funniest thing someone can say when they only remember your value after they've embarrassed themselves elsewhere. And I still didn't respond until one night when I was sitting at home and my phone lit up again with another message request from him. This time more urgent, more invasive, saying he needed to talk before things got serious with someone else in my life. Which was interesting because I hadn't told him anything about my relationship. I hadn't posted anything. I hadn't given him access to that part of my life anymore. So the fact that he even knew anything at all felt like a violation on its own. And I was staring at that message when I heard footsteps behind me, slow and calm. And I turned around and saw my husband standing there. Not my ex, my actual husband. The man who knew how to love without turning it into a scoreboard. And he wasn't angry, he wasn't confused. He just looked at my phone, read the message silently, and then looked at me like he already understood the entire history, without needing explanations. And that was the moment everything about the past felt smaller, not erased, just irrelevant. And my phone lit up again right then, with another call from my ex's name, flashing on the screen, like he still had access to my life on demand. And my husband just tilted his head slightly and said nothing at first. But the silence said everything, because for the first time in this entire story, I wasn't the one sitting there waiting to be chosen. I was already chosen. And the only thing left unanswered was what my ex thought he was going to say that could possibly undo the fact that he already lost. And the second my husband saw that call coming through, the entire room didn't even get loud or dramatic the way movies try to make it. It actually went quiet in a different way, like the air just got heavier. And I remember my ex's name flashing on my screen again like he had no idea his relevance had already expired, and my husband didn't touch my phone, didn't snatch it, didn't act emotional or territorial. He just looked at it for a second and then looked at me and said, "Do you want me to answer it or do you want to?" And that question alone hit me harder than anything my ex had said in months, because there was no panic in it, no insecurity, just choice. And I remember laughing a little under my breath because I couldn't believe I used to live in a world where I would have been scared of this moment. Scared of conflict, scared of men talking over each other about me like I was an object in the middle. But instead, I just took the phone and answered it. And the second I did, I heard his voice like he had been waiting too long to hear mine, instantly shifting into that tone people use when they think they still have emotional authority over you, saying my name like we were still what we used to be, like nothing happened, like he didn't destroy everything with one sentence in a kitchen months ago. And I let him talk for maybe 10 seconds before I interrupted him and said, "Why are you calling me?" And there was a pause, like he didn't expect that version of me. Not the soft one, not the confused one, not the one who used to over-explain everything. And he immediately switched into apology mode, saying he was sorry, that he was going through things, that he didn't mean what he said, that he was just stressed. And I almost laughed again because that phrase, "just stressed," had become his escape hatch for every cruel thing he ever did. And I told him flat out calmly that stress doesn't make you tell someone they're not worthy of being your wife after 4 years. Stress doesn't make you compare your partner to strangers. Stress doesn't make you walk out and replace them 2 seconds later. And while I was speaking, I could feel my husband behind me, not interrupting, not reacting, just present. And that presence alone made everything feel different because I wasn't alone in the emotional chaos anymore. I wasn't trapped in a one-on-one loop with someone who used to twist my reality. And my ex started getting louder on the phone, saying he made a mistake, saying he realized I was the best thing that ever happened to him. And that line almost made me physically recoil because it's always interesting how people only recognize value after they've publicly discarded it. And I told him, "You didn't realize anything, you just got embarrassed." And that shut him up for a second, like truth is always louder than excuses when it lands correctly. And then he tried another angle, saying he saw I had moved on, asking who I was with. And that's when I actually turned slightly and looked at my husband, because suddenly the conversation wasn't even about my ex anymore. It was about how irrelevant he sounded trying to reinsert himself into something he no longer had access to. And my husband finally spoke up from behind me, not yelling, not threatening, just clearly saying, "She's not available to you anymore." And I swear the silence on the phone after that was immediate, like my ex wasn't prepared for another man's voice to exist in the space he thought he still controlled. And then he started stammering, asking who that was. And I said, "That's my husband." And I let that sit there without cushioning it, without softening it, because I used to soften everything for his comfort and I wasn't doing that anymore. And there was another pause before he tried to laugh it off like it was impossible. Like I was lying, like I hadn't been allowed to move on from the wreckage he created. And I just said, "You left me." And that was it. No extra emotion, no anger, just fact. And suddenly he got quiet again. But this time the quiet wasn't powerful, it was exposed. And then he did what people like him always eventually do. He started begging, but in fragments, saying he missed me, saying he couldn't sleep, saying things didn't work out with her, saying he realized too late. And I remember looking at my reflection in the dark screen of the phone while he talked, and thinking how strange it was that I used to believe those words would have meant something to me. But now they just sounded like noise from a life I outgrew, and I told him, "You don't miss me, you miss control." And that's when my husband gently placed a hand on my shoulder, not possessive, just grounding, like reminding me I didn't need to stand in that conversation alone anymore. And I told my ex one last thing, that he doesn't get to insult someone's worth and then come back when his choices collapse, that people aren't exits and re-entries. And then I ended the call, just like that. No dramatic speech, just ended it. And for a few seconds after I hung up, I just stood there holding the phone like I had finally closed something that had been draining me for too long. And then my husband asked me quietly if I was okay. And I said yes, and I realized I actually meant it. But that wasn't even the end of it, because over the next few days my ex didn't stop. It escalated into messages from different numbers, long paragraphs, voice notes, even emails, like he was trying every possible door he used to have access to. And I didn't respond to any of it, but I saw all of it. And what changed wasn't his desperation. It was my indifference growing stronger every time he tried, until it stopped feeling like my past knocking on my door and started feeling like background noise. And then something else happened that I didn't expect, which was that mutual people started telling me things, not gossip in a dramatic way, just updates like he was spiraling socially, trying to explain the breakup to people in ways that didn't match reality, painting himself as misunderstood while conveniently leaving out the part where he told me I wasn't worthy of being his wife. And apparently that version of the story didn't land well with anyone who actually knew both of us, because once people realized the timeline and the disrespect, the sympathy shifted, not because I asked for it, but because truth tends to settle eventually. And I stayed completely out of it. No posts, no explanations, no defending myself, because I learned something important through all of this, which is that you don't heal by winning arguments with someone who already misrepresented you. You heal by no longer needing their version of events at all. And during all of this, my husband never tried to control how I handled it, never asked me to block him, never made it about jealousy. He just stayed consistent, which was honestly more unsettling in the beginning than anything my ex ever did, because calm stability feels unfamiliar when you're used to emotional chaos. And slowly I started noticing the difference between being wanted and being valued, because one is loud and demanding and insecure, and the other is quiet and steady and doesn't need to prove itself. And one night after everything had been quiet for a while, I got one final message from my ex. Not an apology this time, just a short sentence saying he hoped I was happy and that he understood now. And I remember staring at it for a moment and realizing I didn't feel anything. Not anger, not satisfaction, not nostalgia, just nothing. Like reading a name you used to know in a completely different life. And I deleted it without replying. And that was the first time I fully understood that closure isn't something someone gives you. It's something you eventually stop waiting for. And as I put my phone down, my husband walked into the room, asked what it was. I told him it was nothing. And he just nodded like he believed me, because it actually was nothing now. And that's when I realized the real ending of this story wasn't him coming back, or me rejecting him. It was the fact that I could finally hear his name and not feel pulled backward at all. And just as I thought it was finally quiet for good, my phone lit up one more time. Not a message this time, but a call. And I looked at the screen and froze, because it wasn't from a number I recognized at all. It was new, unknown. And when I glanced at my husband, he had already noticed it too. And he didn't say anything, just watched me waiting to see what I would do next, and that's when I answered it. The moment I answered that unknown number, I honestly didn't even hear anything at first. Just a weird silence, like the line was open, but no one had decided to exist on the other end yet. And I remember glancing at my husband without saying anything, because something about it already felt different from my ex's usual chaos. No immediate begging, no rehearsed apology, just nothing. And then finally I heard a voice that wasn't familiar, but also wasn't random. And it said my name slowly, like it was testing if it still had permission to say it. And I said, "Who is this?" Already knowing this wasn't going to be simple. And there was a pause before they said they were calling on behalf of my ex, which immediately made my stomach tighten in that annoyed way more than an emotional way. Because of course, even when he doesn't call directly, he still finds a way to stay in the story. And apparently he had been really struggling and wanted to make sure I understood how much he regretted everything. And I almost interrupted right there because I was tired of the narrative being rewritten like I wasn't the one who lived it. But I let the person talk for a few more seconds just to confirm what I already suspected, which was that my ex wasn't even brave enough to contact me directly anymore. He was outsourcing accountability like it was a task he didn't want to do himself. And I told the person on the phone calmly that I wasn't interested in messages, regrets, or updates, and that anything he needed to say should stay in his own life because he had no access to mine anymore. And I hung up again. But this time I felt something different. Not closure exactly. More like confirmation that he was getting smaller in real time while I stayed exactly where I was. And my husband asked me who it was. Not in a suspicious way, just genuinely curious, and I told him it was nothing connected to my past trying to stay relevant. And he just nodded like that made sense, like he didn't need details to trust the outcome. And I thought that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. Because 2 days later, I got a message request from someone I didn't recognize with a profile picture I didn't expect. And it was my ex's new girlfriend. The same one from the messy situation that had already exploded publicly. And she didn't come in hostile or dramatic like I thought she would. She came in tired, like someone who had also been slowly realizing she was inside a situation she didn't fully understand. And she said she didn't know how to say this properly, but she needed clarity about timelines, about what actually happened between me and him, because apparently he had been telling her a version of events where I was obsessed with him, where I couldn't let go, where I was supposedly trying to interfere in their relationship. And I just stared at that message for a second because it was almost impressive how quickly he had turned reality into fiction, depending on who he was talking to. And instead of spiraling into explaining everything emotionally, I just sent her one thing, screenshots. Not everything, just enough to show the pattern, enough to show the exact sentence he used on me, enough to show how fast he replaced me. And I didn't add commentary because I didn't need to. And she didn't respond for a while, which honestly I expected. But when she did, it was short. Just, "I'm sorry, I didn't know." And then she followed it with, "I think I need to step away from this." And that was it. No drama, no confrontation, just another exit happening quietly. And I remember sitting there after that thinking how strange it was that the same man who once told me I wasn't worthy of being his wife was now losing people around him, not because I fought back, but because the truth didn't match the version he sold. And then the next shift came even more quietly, which was that he started trying to contact me less and less. Not because he suddenly healed or moved on, but because every door he tried was either closed or unanswered. And I could tell because the messages became shorter, less confident, more scattered. Like he was slowly realizing I wasn't going to rescue him from the consequences of his own decisions. And during all of this, my life kept moving forward in the most boringly peaceful way possible. Which is honestly what people don't expect after chaos. Because there were no dramatic revenge moments, no big confrontation, just consistency, stability, and someone next to me who didn't treat love like something that needed to be earned through suffering. And then one evening while I was cooking, my husband casually mentioned he had noticed I hadn't checked my phone in hours, and I laughed because I didn't even realize that used to be my habit. Constantly waiting for something to go wrong, constantly scanning for emotional threats. And I said no, I just didn't need to anymore. And he didn't turn it into a deep moment or a speech. He just said good, like it was normal, like peace wasn't something surprising. And that night, just when everything felt completely quiet, I got one final notification, not a message request, not a call, just a single line email from my ex with no greeting, no explanation, just, "I see now what I lost." And I remember staring at it for a long time, not because it affected me, but because it didn't. Because there was a time that sentence would have pulled me into a spiral of emotion and analysis and doubt. But now it just looked like something written too late to matter, and I deleted it without replying. And I didn't tell my husband about it immediately because I didn't even think it was worth mentioning. But somehow he already noticed my expression changed slightly and he just looked at me and said, "Him again?" And I nodded once and said, "Last one." And he didn't ask for details because he didn't need them. And I thought that was the end of the entire situation. The full stop, the closure, the final silence. But the next morning when I opened my phone, there was one more unexpected notification waiting. A calendar invite from an unknown email. And the title was just my name. And I froze because for the first time in all of this, it didn't feel like he was trying to get my attention anymore. It felt like he was trying to physically place himself back into my timeline. And when I looked up, my husband was already standing in the doorway again, watching my face. And he asked quietly what it was. And I didn't answer immediately because I was still reading it, still processing the fact that even after everything, there was still another attempt, another reach, another way he thought he could re-enter my life. And that's when I clicked it open and saw the location attached. And it wasn't a message anymore. It was an actual scheduled meeting request with my name and his. I stared at that calendar invite for a few seconds that felt way longer than they should have, because it wasn't just another message anymore. It was structured, intentional, like he had upgraded from emotional spam to something more calculated. And the fact that he thought he could schedule access to me like I was still part of his life made something in me go completely still instead of emotional. And I didn't even respond right away because I was trying to understand if this was confidence or delusion. And my husband was standing in the doorway watching my face like he already knew it wasn't good news. And I finally turned the phone slightly so he could see it. And I said, "He sent a meeting invite." And he didn't even react dramatically, he just let out a small breath through his nose like he found it almost predictable. And said, "For what?" And that's when I opened it fully and read the note underneath, which was just a few lines saying he wanted proper closure in person, that he had grown a lot, and that it would help us both move forward like adults. And I almost laughed again because the irony of someone who shattered respect, trying to teach maturity through a scheduled appointment, was actually insane. And I said out loud, mostly to myself, "He thinks I'm going to sit down with him." And my husband leaned against the wall and said very calmly, "You're not." Not as a question, not as pressure, just fact. And in that moment, I realized something important, which was that I wasn't even debating it internally. There was no part of me that felt pulled back anymore. Just curiosity at how far someone could go when they refused to accept an ending. And I declined the invite without replying, not out of anger, but because there was genuinely nothing left to negotiate, and I thought that would be the final layer of it. But I underestimated how people like that behave when they lose control of the narrative completely, because within hours he started texting again from a new number. This time not apologizing, not begging, but trying to provoke emotion, saying things like, "I know you're doing this to punish me," and "You always were stubborn." And that shift told me everything, because when apologies stop and blame returns, it means they haven't changed at all. They're just frustrated they don't have access. And I didn't respond, I just blocked the number, and then another came. And another, like he was testing how many doors he could knock on before realizing the house was no longer his. And somewhere in all of that, I started noticing something even more interesting, which was how unaffected I was becoming. Not cold, just detached from the emotional weight he used to have over me, like I was watching a version of my life I had already outgrown. And my husband never once told me what to do about it. He didn't tell me to block everything or confront anything. He just stayed consistent, making breakfast, asking normal questions, living like none of that noise could reach us unless we opened the door. And that contrast alone made everything clearer, because I could finally see what stability actually felt like, versus emotional volatility disguised as passion. And then one afternoon, while I was out running errands, I got a notification that someone had left a comment on an old post of mine, which I almost ignored. But curiosity made me open it, and it was from a mutual acquaintance saying my ex had been telling people I was obsessed with him still, that I couldn't move on, and that he had been trying to help me heal. And I just stood there in a parking lot reading that like it was a completely different person being described, because the gap between what I lived and what he was telling people was so wide it almost felt fictional. And instead of reacting emotionally, I just realized something simple but heavy, which was that he wasn't trying to reconnect with me. He was trying to repair his image of me in his head and in other people's heads so he didn't have to sit with what he actually did. And that realization removed the last emotional thread he had left. And that night, I told my husband everything in one go. Not because I needed advice, but because I wanted to close the loop out loud. And he listened quietly the whole time, then just said, "He's not trying to get you back. He's trying to undo his consequences." And that sentence landed so cleanly it almost felt like the final explanation I never got from any of it. And for the first time, I didn't feel confusion about his behavior at all, just clarity. And then the next morning, something unexpected happened, which was that the messages stopped entirely. No new numbers, no emails, no attempts, just silence. And at first, I didn't trust it because silence after chaos always feels suspicious, like you're waiting for the next shoe to drop. But days turned into a week and nothing came. And I started to realize that even he had reached the point where continuing wasn't giving him anything anymore. And that's when the final shift happened for me. Not closure from him, but indifference from me. Because I didn't even check for updates anymore. I didn't scan my phone expecting anything. And then one night while we were just sitting together watching something random on TV, my husband's phone buzzed and he glanced at it and then looked at me for a second. And I could tell without even asking that it had something to do with all of this again. But instead of tension, I just felt distant from it. Like it belonged to a version of my life that had already ended. And he showed me the screen without hesitation, and it was a message forwarded from someone else saying my ex had apparently been asking people if I was really happy, and if I ever think about him. And I just looked at it for a second and then shrugged a little and said, "I don't." And I meant both things. I didn't think about him, and I wasn't carrying anything from him anymore. And my husband didn't make it a moment, didn't turn it into anything dramatic. He just set his phone down and went back to the show, like it was irrelevant noise. And that's when it fully hit me that the story I thought was about being left and replaced had actually turned into something else entirely, which was me becoming unreachable to someone who once thought I would always be available. And just as I was thinking that, my phone lit up one more time, and for the first time in weeks, it wasn't an unknown number or a message or an email. It was his name again. But this time it wasn't a call or text. It was a voicemail notification. And I stared at it without moving, and my husband noticed and said quietly, "Do you want to hear it?" And I looked at him, then back at the phone, and I realized I didn't feel fear or curiosity or anger. I just felt done in a way I couldn't unfeel, and that's when I pressed play. The voicemail started with his breathing before any words came through, like he had recorded it multiple times and still couldn't figure out how to start without sounding exactly like what he was. Someone who had lost access and couldn't accept it, and then his voice finally came in low, slower than before, almost careful, saying my name like it was something fragile he was trying not to break again. And I remember standing there listening while my husband stayed completely still beside me, not leaning in, not reacting, just letting me have the moment fully without interference. And my ex started talking about how everything got out of hand, how he never meant for it to go like this, and how life hadn't been the same since I walked away, which made me almost laugh again because he still couldn't say it correctly, still couldn't acknowledge that he was the one who ended it, and instead kept framing reality like I had abandoned him, like he didn't look me in the eye and tell me I wasn't worthy of being his wife. And then there was a pause in the voicemail where I could hear him breathing again, like he was waiting for some imagined response from me even though I wasn't there. And then he said the part that finally made something in me fully detach, which was, "I know you're trying to prove a point, but you don't have to punish me forever." And that sentence told me everything I needed to know. Because in his mind, even now, months later, I wasn't a person who moved on. I was a reaction to him. And I just looked down at the phone during that part and felt nothing rise up at all. No anger, no sadness, just distance. And when the voicemail ended, there was a second of silence in the room that felt louder than his entire message. And my husband finally spoke softly and said, "That sounded like someone still talking to control the ending." And I nodded because that's exactly what it was. Not closure, not reflection, just another attempt to reopen a door that had already been taken off its hinges. And I deleted the voicemail without saving it, not as a statement, but because there was genuinely no reason to keep it. And that's when I noticed something I didn't expect, which was that my body didn't react the way it used to anymore. No racing thoughts, no second guessing, no emotional replay, just calm, almost boring calm. Like my system had finally stopped treating him like a threat or a question. And I remember sitting down after that and just exhaling, because I realized how long I had lived in a state of constant emotional anticipation, waiting for him to either return or disrupt something again. And now there was nothing to wait for. And my husband sat next to me and quietly asked if I wanted to go out for food later. And the normalness of that question hit harder than anything in the voicemail, because it reminded me that real life doesn't sound like that. It doesn't sound like apologies that never take accountability or speeches that rewrite history. It sounds like simple choices and peace that doesn't require interpretation. And I said yes without hesitation. And we left later that evening and nothing dramatic happened on the way there. No interruptions, no surprises, just traffic and conversation and ordinary life. And I remember thinking how strange it was that the most healing part of everything wasn't revenge or confrontation or even justice. It was just the absence of emotional chaos. But of course that wasn't the final end, because people like my ex don't disappear cleanly. They fade and reappear in ways that test whether you're still reachable. And a few days later I got one final message request, this time from a completely new account with no name I recognized. And the message was only one line that said, "I just want to understand why you changed." And I stared at it for a long time because that was the question underneath everything he had ever said to me. Not why I left, not why I didn't respond, but why I stopped being someone he could affect. And I didn't reply, not because I didn't have words, but because the answer wasn't something he could receive in a message anymore. And as I deleted that request too, I realized something that finally closed everything fully, which was that I hadn't changed in the way he meant. I had just stopped participating in a version of myself that existed only to manage his reactions. And the moment I accepted that, the entire story stopped feeling like something that was still happening to me, and became something that had already ended a long time ago. And right as I put my phone down that night, my husband looked over at me and asked if everything was finally quiet. And I looked back at him and said, "Yeah." And for the first time in a long time, it actually was. And when I said it was quiet, I didn't mean just his messages stopped. I meant something deeper than that. Like my entire life had finally stopped bracing for impact, and I didn't even realize how tense I had been for so long until there was nothing left to tense up for. And that night felt different in the most ordinary way possible, because nothing dramatic happened. No sudden call, no unexpected interruption, just normal life continuing without him in it. And I remember sitting there thinking about how strange it was that the person who once took up so much emotional space in my head now barely took up any at all, like he had been slowly shrinking in importance until he was just a memory with no weight. And the next morning I woke up and checked my phone out of habit, and there was nothing, not even a new attempt. And instead of feeling suspicious or anxious, I just put it back down and got ready for the day. And my husband was already in the kitchen like he always is, doing something simple, and he looked up and asked what I wanted to eat like that was the biggest decision of the day. And I remember thinking how insane it was that I used to live in emotional unpredictability, and now my biggest stress was breakfast choices, and that contrast made me realize how distorted my old relationship had been. Because I used to think chaos meant passion, that confusion meant depth, that someone making you question yourself meant you cared more. But now I understood it was just instability wearing a mask, and over the next few days I noticed I wasn't checking my phone the same way anymore. I wasn't scanning notifications for his name, or waiting for another attempt to pull me back into something I already left. And then one afternoon while I was out, I ran into someone who used to know both of us, and they casually mentioned that my ex had been telling people he lost me because I changed, like I had transformed into a different person overnight. And I just smiled a little because from his perspective, that was probably easier than admitting I just stopped accepting disrespect. And I didn't correct the story because I realized I didn't need to. Because people will believe what fits their comfort until reality forces them not to. And later that week, I got one final message request that wasn't even dramatic anymore. Just a single sentence from a new account saying, "I guess you really moved on." And I stared at it for a second and felt nothing rise up. Not pride, not anger, not sadness, just distance. Like I was reading about someone else's life, and I deleted it without replying. And that was the first time I fully understood that closure doesn't come from the person who hurt you finally understanding. It comes from you no longer needing them to. And that night, my husband and I were just sitting on the couch talking about random things. Nothing deep, nothing heavy. And at one point, he asked me if I ever think about that part of my life anymore. And I paused for a second and realized I didn't. Not in the emotional way I used to, not in the replaying way. Just as a memory that existed without pulling me backward, and I said, "Not really." And he just nodded like that was enough. Like nothing more needed to be extracted from it. And that's when I understood the real ending of everything. Wasn't him begging or me rejecting or any final confrontation. It was the fact that my life no longer made room for him in it at all. Not even as noise in the background. And just when I thought that was it, the final silence settled completely. I got one last notification late at night, and for the first time it wasn't a message, it wasn't a voicemail, it wasn't a request. It was just an old archived photo popping up in memories from years ago, back when things were still normal, back when I didn't know how it would end. And I stared at it for a moment and then deleted it too. And as I put my phone down, I realized there was nothing left to respond to, nothing left to explain, nothing left to fix. Because the story had already ended long before he realized it had. And I was already living the part where it didn't matter anymore. He didn't stay quiet for long after that final silence phase, because people like him don't actually handle endings, they just change tactics. And I found that out the day I got a call from an unknown number while I was out with my husband doing something completely normal like running errands, and I almost ignored it. But something about the persistence made me pick up, and the second I said hello, I already knew it was connected to him again, because the voice on the other end sounded nervous in a way that wasn't random. And they introduced themselves as someone from his side of things again, not him directly this time. And I could literally feel my patience disappear before they even finished the sentence, because apparently now, he wasn't just sending messages or voicemails, he was involving people around him like it was some kind of campaign to re-enter my life. And they told me he was really not doing well, and that I should just hear him out once so he can get closure. And I actually stopped walking in the middle of the parking lot and laughed a little under my breath because the idea of him needing closure from me, after everything, was almost insulting in a different way. Like he still thought I was responsible for managing his emotional consequences. And I told the person on the phone very calmly that I was not available for any more conversations, direct or indirect, and that if he needed closure, he could get it from the decision he made when he left, and I hung up before they could respond. And my husband, who had been walking a step ahead, turned around and asked what that was, and I told him, same thing, different face. And he just nodded like he understood without needing details. But what I didn't know yet was that this wasn't the end of it, because later that evening I got a message from someone completely unexpected, one of his close friends. And the tone was different, less dramatic, more honest, and it basically said that he had shown up at their place earlier talking about me nonstop, saying I was the one mistake he couldn't fix, and that he was acting like he genuinely couldn't accept that I had moved on. And I just stared at that message for a long time because it confirmed something I already suspected, which was that this wasn't about love anymore. It was about control and ego and not being able to sit with being replaced in someone else's life narrative. And I didn't respond to that either. But the part that actually shifted things was what happened 2 days later, when I got a notification that someone had tried to add me on social media from a brand new account with no posts, no followers, nothing except a profile picture that looked like it was taken quickly in a mirror. And I didn't even have to open it to know it was him trying again in a different form. And that's when I finally realized how far it had gone. Because he had moved from messaging to calling to involving other people to creating new identities just to reach a version of me that no longer existed in the same emotional space. And I just deleted the request without reacting. And I remember thinking how strange it was that something that used to consume my thoughts daily now couldn't even get a response out of me. And that night, my husband and I were sitting together watching something completely unimportant. And my phone buzzed again on the table, and I didn't even pick it up right away. And my husband glanced at it and then back at me and said, "Still him?" And I said, "Yeah, but it doesn't feel like anything anymore." And I realized I meant it, because there was no anxiety attached to it now, no anticipation. Just background noise I didn't feel responsible for anymore. And that should have been the ending already. But the final shift came the next morning, when I woke up to one last email from him, longer than the others, carefully written, almost rehearsed, saying he finally understood that he lost something real, that he never should have spoken out of anger, and that he just wanted to see me one last time to make things right. And I remember sitting on the edge of the bed reading it while my husband was still asleep next to me, and for the first time I didn't feel pulled into any emotional direction at all. Not anger, not nostalgia, not sympathy, just clarity. And I deleted it without even finishing it. And that's when I knew there really wasn't anything left to continue. Because even the attempts had stopped feeling like interruptions and started feeling like echoes from a life I had already stepped out of. And just as I put my phone down, my husband woke up and asked what time it was, completely unaware of everything that had just passed through my screen. And I told him it was early. And that everything was quiet again. And he smiled a little and closed his eyes like that was all that mattered. And in that moment, I understood that the real ending wasn't him finally stopping. It was me no longer needing him to. And just as the morning settled in, my phone lit up one more time on the bedside table, and for the first time in all of this, it wasn't a message or an email or a call, it was a notification that someone had been waiting outside my apartment building. The second I saw that notification about someone waiting outside my apartment building, my whole body didn't panic the way it used to months ago. It just went still. Like my brain had finally learned the difference between real danger and emotional noise trying to disguise itself as urgency. And I sat sat there for a second staring at the screen while my husband was still half asleep beside me. And I didn't wake him immediately because something about it didn't feel like a surprise anymore. It felt like the last predictable move in a pattern I had already studied too many times. And I opened the notification fully and saw it was from building security saying someone had been asking for me by name, insisting it was important, and I already knew before I even asked who it was. And I got up, went to the window, and looked down, and there he was, my ex, standing near the entrance like he still had a right to be part of my life just because he showed up physically instead of digitally this time. And he looked different in a way I can't fully explain. Not better, not worse, just desperate in a way that doesn't match the version of himself he used to present. And I stood there watching him for a few seconds without reacting because there was no emotional surge, just observation, like I was looking at someone trying to open a door that had already been removed. And behind me, I heard my husband get up, and I turned slightly and told him he was downstairs. And he didn't rush, didn't get angry, didn't even ask questions right away. He just walked over, looked out the window once, and said, "Do you want him gone from here?" And that question hit me harder than anything else in this entire story because it wasn't about control or jealousy or reaction, it was about boundaries. And I realized I didn't feel fear, I felt inconvenience, like someone was interrupting a life they no longer belonged to, and I said no. Not because I wanted closure or confrontation, but because I genuinely didn't want any interaction at all. And my husband nodded, picked up his phone, and called building security calmly. No drama, no escalation, just stating the situation. And I watched my ex below get approached by staff, and I could see him trying to explain something, gesturing toward the building like there was still a version of reality where he had access to me. But the more he talked, the more it became obvious that he didn't. And I didn't stay at the window to watch it play out like some revenge moment. I actually turned away first because it wasn't satisfying or emotional, it was just over. And I went back to bed. And that might sound unbelievable considering everything that led up to it, but that's exactly how it felt. Like the final attempt had already failed before it even started. And when my husband came back in, he didn't even need to explain what happened because I already knew. And he just said, "Handled." Like it was nothing more than that. And I remember lying there for a while after he left for work thinking about how long I used to believe closure had to be loud, dramatic, emotional, some kind of confrontation where everything gets said perfectly, but instead it turns out closure is just the moment someone tries to pull you back and realizes there's nothing left to grab. And the next few days after that were completely different in a way I didn't expect because nothing else came, no new accounts, no messages, no indirect attempts, and it wasn't suspicious anymore, it was just done, like a habit finally ending. And I noticed I wasn't checking anything anymore either, not because I was avoiding something, but because there was nothing to check for. And one evening while I was cooking, I caught myself thinking about how strange it was that the most chaotic chapter of my life ended without a final speech or confrontation. Just a man standing outside a building being told no access. And I almost smiled at that because it was so simple compared to how much energy it used to take to survive it. And later that night, my husband asked me casually if I ever regretted any of it. And I paused for a second, not because I was conflicted, but because I was making sure the answer was honest. And I said no, not even the painful parts. Because if none of it had happened, I probably wouldn't have learned how easy it is to mistake inconsistency for love, or confusion for depth, or apology cycles for change. And he didn't turn it into a deep conversation, he just said, "Good." Like that was the only answer that mattered. And I went to bed that night feeling something I hadn't felt through most of this entire story. Which wasn't happiness or relief, it was absence. The absence of weight, the absence of waiting, the absence of someone else shaping my emotional state without permission. And just as I was falling asleep, my phone lit up one last time on the nightstand, and for a split second my chest didn't even tighten. I just looked over at it calmly, and it was a notification from a blocked number attempt, automatically filtered, no message visible, just the system catching something before it could reach me. And I remember turning over, not even opening it, and letting it disappear on its own, because by then I finally understood the real ending wasn't him stopping completely. It was the fact that even if he tried again, there was nowhere left inside me for it to land. And after that notification got filtered and disappeared on its own, nothing else came through. Not because I was waiting for it anymore, but because there was genuinely nothing left on the other side to push into my life. And that realization didn't hit me like a dramatic moment. It just settled in quietly over the next few days, like something finally stopping its noise after running in the background for too long. And I started noticing how different everything felt when I wasn't mentally preparing for interruption all the time, because I wasn't checking my phone with that small tight feeling in my chest anymore. I wasn't analyzing silence for meaning. I wasn't replaying conversations that didn't exist anymore. And instead, life just kept moving forward in a way that felt almost suspicious at first, because I was so used to emotional instability that stability felt unfamiliar. And I remember one evening sitting in the kitchen while my husband was cooking and realizing I hadn't thought about my ex at all that entire day, not even in passing. And that shocked me more than any message he had ever sent, because I used to think forgetting someone meant forcing them out of your mind. But it turns out it just happens when they stop having access to you in any meaningful way. And later that night, I asked my husband something random, like how he always stays so calm even when things get messy, and he just shrugged and said, "Because not everything needs a reaction." And that sentence stuck with me longer than I expected, because my old life was built entirely around reactions. His reactions, my reactions, everyone reacting to everything constantly like that was normal. And now I was living in something that didn't require emotional survival mode just to exist. And over time I started noticing even my body felt different, like I wasn't bracing anymore. Not for texts, not for calls, not for appearances or explanations or sudden emotional spikes, and it made me think about how long I had mistaken intensity for connection. Because what I used to call love was actually just inconsistency that kept me emotionally activated all the time. And now I was learning what it felt like to not be activated, just steady, just present. And one afternoon, I ran into someone who used to know both of us, and they casually mentioned my ex had finally stopped talking about the past so much, like it had been a phase he was going through. And I just nodded because I didn't need updates anymore. Not out of bitterness, but because it didn't connect to my life at all. Like hearing about a character from a show I stopped watching halfway through. And then came the final thing I ever heard about him. Not from him, not from a message, but from someone else mentioning that he had been trying to explain the situation differently to new people, saying it didn't end the way it looked. And I remember thinking how exhausting it must be to keep trying to edit a story that other people have already lived through and moved on from. And that was the moment I fully understood that I wasn't waiting for closure anymore, because I already had it. Not from him, but from everything that happened after him. From the silence that didn't hurt. From the absence that didn't pull me back. From the fact that my life no longer made room for emotional chaos disguised as love. And that night I sat with my husband and we were just talking about normal things again. Nothing deep, nothing heavy, just life. And at some point he asked me if I ever think about that time anymore. And I paused only long enough to be honest with myself and said, not like I used to. And he nodded like that was exactly what he expected. And I realized then that the biggest ending in all of this wasn't him stopping his attempts or me blocking him or anything dramatic like that. It was the moment I stopped being someone who could be reached through emotional disruption. And just as I was thinking that, my phone lit up one last time on the table out of habit more than anything else. And I looked at it without tension for the first time in a long time. And it was nothing. Just a routine notification from a blocked attempt that never even reached me. And I didn't feel anything about it at all. Not satisfaction, not anger, not curiosity, just neutrality. And I let the screen go dark again without touching it. And in that moment, I finally understood what moving on actually was. Not the absence of a person, but the absence of their ability to affect you. And that was the end of it. Not loud, not dramatic, just finished.